Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and today what I wanted to do is put on your radar something that is of great professional interest to me. I tend to use the term semantic taxonomy for it. Not everyone will use that term, and I've seen that term used to mean something else in computing apparently. But what it is an investigation of what people mean by words, and particularly how they, that's semantics, but the taxonomy part of it is how they categorize them, how they fold them into one another. So I want to talk a little bit about some potential applications of semantic taxonomy, some potential examples of it, and perhaps encourage other people interested in linguistics to pursue more research questions in this particular subfield. So my own PhD dissertation is on a question of semantic taxonomy. It's called The Historical Development of Basic Color Terms in Old Norse, Icelandic, and you can find it online, various places, at least at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I did my PhD. I think it's also online at the University of Colorado Boulder, because I taught there, and I think they upload faculty's dissertations for some reason. Anyway, it's a public document, so go take a look at it if this interests you. And what I'm looking at there is, well, let's start with why this is an interesting question. There's such a thing as a scientific way to classify color. But if you look at a color wheel, there's no scientific line between, say, green and blue, or between yellow and green. Right? There's no point at which every single person and every single scholar of every field is going to agree this particular pixel is yellow and this one is green. There's always going to be some confusion at the edges there. And then there's going to be languages where yellow and green are one category. So our English color categories, if we get down to the most basic color terms that we can use, they're not arbitrary, because there are some near universals, although I don't believe in as many universals as some scholars in, say, the Berlin K tradition do. But while not being exactly arbitrary, they do differ from language to language. So, for example, if we look at two things that English will call one color, let's say something that's a very dark blue, like, goodness, I should have come up with an example beforehand. Like the feathers of a Steller's jay, very common birds here. And then something that's a very light blue, say a very light turquoise. English will call both of those blue, right? They both fall within the category blue. If I ask an English speaker, what color is this? Use the most basic word you can. The English speaker will say blue for both of them. However, that doesn't mean that an English speaker doesn't distinguish between those two colors, right? We can tell they're different, lighter blue versus darker blue. We just categorize them the same, if you see what I'm saying. The difference is one thing, the category is sort of another. Now in Russian, for example, that light blue and that dark blue are not the same category. They're sini and goluboy. Excuse me if those don't sound quite right to you. I'm not a Russian speaker. So they're different categories. Now an English speaker can kind of understand that and say, okay, yeah, you're reflecting the distinction more strongly by categorizing it differently. But then English also reflects certain distinctions by categorizing them differently, but other languages don't. For example, the Celtic languages traditionally, although speakers probably do now, but traditionally didn't distinguish between blue and green. They were one category, for example, glass. Now, that doesn't mean that a speaker of Welsh or Irish wouldn't distinguish between you know, something that is the color of grass and something that's the color of the sky, but then you have to use terms like that to distinguish them. Just like how in English, you notice how I struggled a little bit to say, you know, a very dark blue, a very light blue. I have to use extra words like that to show you what I mean from within the category. So in my color research, what I was doing was saying, well, I went through and I read every single thing that I could think to read in Old Norse of multiple different genres, you know, fiction, nonfiction, over a fairly wide span of time. And although they were all Icelandic texts, and I looked to see what can we see from this, what color categories there were in Old Norse. And I think that the most striking discoveries, and I've talked about this in more detail in particular videos, which I'll show on the screen, you can find if you want more on this in particular. But what I found that was most surprising was that the really common notion that Old Norse doesn't have a category for blue isn't true. This is actually one of the Stella's Jace just walking right now. The reason people think that is because they call ravens blue, but that has nothing to do with how they categorize color. They categorize blue and black differently. They talk about blue and black eyes. Things that we would call blue, they call blue like a clear sky. But because ravens, when you look at them under direct sunlight, reflect back a blue sheen, it's a poetic observation that's very true to their color, but doesn't reflect that they don't have a blue category. Interestingly, in prose, they do call ravens black, so it is a poetic thing that they call ravens blue. But then, so that's, I think, disproving a very common notion about Old Norse. And then I introduced a new idea that I thought was pretty interesting, that Old Norse does not distinguish between categories inside of very large warm color categories. So the very large warm color category is red, rauður in Old Norse, rauður in modern Icelandic pronunciation. They have focal red, right? A good example of red is the color of blood. But anything else that's warm color is red, right? So gold is red, the sun is red, the yolk of an egg is red. Now that doesn't mean that they don't see the difference between that and focal red, between the color of blood and the color of an egg yolk. But by default, they will describe those as red, just as by default we would describe the color of turquoise as blue, even though it might not be the first thing we think of when we think of blue. Our first thought of blue might be a darker blue like the sky. I'm thinking of a very light turquoise here for this kind of example. So my research led me into color terms of Old Norse, but there's a lot of other applications of semantic taxonomy. I'll give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. I'll come back and talk about a couple other places you can find semantic taxonomy. So I would be interested to see further studies on the semantic taxonomy of colors and other languages. But there's also a lot of other places semantic taxonomy comes up. For example, animals. So pre-scientific classifications of animals, which is what our language is mostly based on, are not necessarily going to reflect scientific notions about what kinds of animals there are by genus and species and whatnot. For example, the term fish, used in English in a pre-modern pre-scientific concept, I mean anything that lives in the water, right? So whales, dolphins, which have a fish-like body shape, but also something like an otter is apparently a fish in something like Old English. Now, that's, you know, apparently the term fish is a little bit vexed from a scientific perspective too. We're really talking about a lot of different types of animals, you know, vertebrates versus cartilaginous fish versus something like a lamprey. And it's fairly hard, I think, to define fish in a way that doesn't sort of accidentally include us, because so many of the features that distinguish fish from their ancestors still distinguish us from fish's ancestors. So there's still scientifically vexing questions about what a fish is, but linguistically what a fish is really, originally, animal in the water, right? Even snake in the water. In the same way, today in modern language, people can kind of struggle with semantically classifying some animals. I think the clearest example of this, although a slightly jokey example of it in normal language, is dog, right? What do you think of when you think of a dog? And for me, I don't know, a golden retriever is probably like the first picture that comes to mind, right? So that's kind of my best example of dog. Things that are more like a golden retriever are much more quick to label dog. You get to something that looks really different from, say, a golden retriever, you know, like a poodle or a chihuahua, or you know, even like a dachshund or something. And I don't know. It's not that I don't see it as a dog. It's just that if I'm making lists of dog, I'm much more quickly going to come up with golden retriever, Labrador, German Shepherd, something like that. You know, something that has a similar body shape, similar size to like a golden retriever. And then this goes way beyond just animals, you know, and it goes beyond nouns and adjectives, right? Nouns like animal, fish, dog, adjectives like color. But I should give another example of an adjective beside color. Another one is, it's interesting how in different languages people will classify beauty. Right, so in English we have words beautiful, handsome, pretty, just to take the first thing that come to my mind. That in a sense all mean the same thing, visually pleasing, right? But there's particular different ways that these get used, right? If I say beautiful, you probably think that I'm talking about Lauren. If you've seen her in my shorts, right? You're thinking of I think that the default association is, in a human context, adult woman. Beautiful is also kind of the default for non-human things, right? Beautiful landscape, beautiful day. Pretty, like adult woman is there. I feel like it also gets used more, like it's cutesier than beautiful, right? It's maybe a little bit, somehow it seems to me that it kind of trends towards small things, like this is a pretty pen, or this is a pretty flower, right? I feel like there's a little bit of a semantic association with smallness there. And then handsome tends to be more like adult men, right? Not that all of these terms aren't somewhat interchangeable. I could see how you could speak of someone being beautiful, pretty, and handsome, but I feel like you're kind of emphasizing different things, right? She's a beautiful woman, overall comment. She's dressed very pretty today. You know, I feel like if you call that same woman handsome, you're kind of saying like she's like well put together, right? Like she's handsomely dressed, I guess makes sort of sense of a woman. Although handsome seems to be very coded toward the masculine world, but it doesn't seem wrong to use it of women. Just as beautiful is very coded toward women, but it's not totally wrong sounding to use it of a man. It seems like you're making some kind of odd observation. So in the same way, Old Norse has multiple different words for beauty. You know, there's at least 3 major words that can be used of human beauty: fager, frider, van. And from my research into this question, fager, kind of like beautiful, seems to be a very default description of person or non-human thing that's visually appealing. A woman can be fager, somewhat less often a man can be fager, although they describe men that way fairly commonly. And then there's frider, which really seems to be especially coded toward women, and seems to be a little bit of a more striking term than fager. It's maybe one shade up. Although to say that someone is fagrest, right, fairest, most fager, is very strong. But of course, fridust, most frider, is very, very strong too. And then there's van, which can be used of all kinds of beautiful things, but seems to carry with it a suggestion of promise. So perhaps a landscape that holds particular promise for a farm, or it seems to be pretty often used of young people, men and women both, who are like, you know, a promising marriage partner or something like that. So different shades of difference than, say, beautiful handsome, pretty have in English, but sort of a similar thing. We're dividing visually appealing among some words that have different first-order associations. Another example of how semantic taxonomy can be interesting is looking at verbs. So, for example, in English, we distinguish between hunt, right? I hunt an elk, I hunt a deer, I hunt a boar, and fish, right? I'm fishing for trout, as people often do in this river. In Old Norse, veiða covers both of those. You veiða dyr, you hunt an animal, but you also veiða fisk. Veiða fiska, you hunt for fish. Now that doesn't sound wrong in English, exactly. Like if I tell you that I'm hunting for fish, I guess you can get a sense of what I'm doing, although it kind of sounds like maybe I'm standing by the river with a rifle and I'm, gonna try to pull off a lucky shot, which is not the smartest thing in the world to shoot at water, but that's sort of maybe the image that you might get, right? So hunt and fish are semantically classified as different activities in English, not necessarily classified as different activities in Old Norse. And then, of course, something like ancient Greek has different verbs for love that reflect, something more like it. If I remember this right, I don't. This is such a common factoid on the internet that I'm sure whatever I would say about the specific words here is going to be attacked, but it's something like, distinction between sexual romantic love, brotherly love, spiritual love. English can distinguish between all those two, but then you have to add extra words, right? It's just like saying like a darker red, it's a spiritual love versus a romantic love. I say I love you, Lauren, and it means something different than when I say I love trout, right? Totally different thing. In some languages, it's ludicrous that that's a different verb. But in English, love is judged by its context. It's a very semantically broad term that embraces lots of different actual specific meanings, and the whole sentence has to be appreciated in order to get to what I mean by that verb. You have to understand my relation with the object. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this because it's such an interesting difference between languages, and I wanted to put a label on it, or maybe encourage people to use this label that I've been using for a while. Maybe encourage some research about this, because I know some people who watch this channel are involved in graduate programs in linguistics or fields like that. Well, I thank you for your support. Patreon, Ko-Fi, thank you for taking my Old Norse classes. Working on getting the schedule out for this fall classes soon. There'll be a beginner class, and at least I'll do the part 2 class again. I might even do a part 3 class. And thank you for buying my books. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, wishing you all the best.